Hi, this is Carrie, and I'm just going to walk you through a little screen tutorial to help you understand the teaching application assignment for 2600. First, you want to think about the teaching application assignment as a process. And that process is going to involve three kinds of work. You're going to assess students to figure out what they know and what they could learn next. Then you're going to plan instruction, and that should be age appropriate and aligned with what's going on in the classroom. So if you're working with pre-linguistic 3-year-olds, your instruction is going to look very different than if you're working with pre-kindergarten 5-year-olds. Then you're going to also plan not just what you're going to do in terms of teaching, you'll plan some documentation as a way of assessing what kids have learned from your teaching. Then you're going to teach the lesson, and you will, after or during the lesson, depending on how you've planned your documentation, you will collect some assessment. So you're kind of in a process that is sort of cyclical. The beginning of this starts with thinking about the question, how can you determine which concepts about print your preschooler knows or needs to learn? I'm using for an example the idea of teaching print referencing, read aloud, which would focus on concepts about print. So we've learned a couple of ways to assess what students know about concepts about print. You could look at the list of concepts about print that we have from class and do some observation. See if you can observe a student or two in your classroom and see what they know about things like book handling, print concepts, or directionality. Those observations you would want to record as anecdotal records, which means you would want to write those observations down and put the date when you were observing them. And that document then would serve as an assessment. Or you could give the entire or parts of the concepts about print assessment. And we practiced a concepts about print assessment in class using a scripted protocol, and you all have a copy of the book at the library that you could use. You could look at this concepts about print test and maybe even working in collaboration with your teacher, maybe there's parts that she thinks the students would be most likely to know, and you could adapt the test to make it shorter if you thought that would be a good idea. What is not a good reason for teaching a lesson is my teacher said to do it, right? My teacher said to read this book because students need to learn concepts about print. That's not what we're doing. What I'm looking at is your ability to choose some assessment strategies that are appropriate for your students and to gather data so that you can know what your students need to learn. Sometimes teachers do provide us with this kind of support in the field, but you really want to go through the process of figuring out what students need to learn, and you need to have some visible data to build that lesson on. All right. The other thing we could think about when we're thinking about what to teach would be to look at some of the standards for preschool. Now, there were standards in effect, and people were using them up until last year. Maybe some schools are still using them that look like this. These are the old Ohio standards. And the old Ohio standards would break a particular content down by age. So print concepts we have here, and it was broken down by birth to 8 months, toddler, older toddlers, and then pre-kindergarten. And then there would be standards based on the age of the student. These younger kids would have more emergent standards, and older kids would have a little bit more sophisticated standards. The new standards look a little bit different. The new standards are linked on our class Brightspace. They're just under the tab Early Learning and Development Standards. And these new standards were written in 22. They took effect in 24. So you should start seeing these in your preschools. And we're going to use these for your assignment in this class. So you can see they are broken down into particular areas. We're looking to teach language and literacy, so these would be the standards that you'll use. There are standards for mathematics and health and physical development, social and emotional, social studies. There's all kinds of standards. But again, for this 3-lesson assignment in 2600, we're focused on language and literacy. So a couple of concepts that you might want to be familiar with as you read these standards is we're going to have standards which define sort of a scope or a sequence of things that students need to learn. The standards sometimes point to curriculum or some suggestions about how you might teach those things to students. And then we have separate kinds of conversations about how you would assess those things. The structure of the current assessments, or I'm sorry, the structure of the current standards, the 2022 publication, is this, that there will be particular domains. So language and literacy is a domain, math is a domain, science is a domain. And then within any one of those domains, so within language and literacy, there are strands. So these are topics or big ideas. And then within those topics or big ideas, you would have the standard statement. And then they describe what that standard would look like across a number of developmental milestones. So instead of thinking about this in terms of age, these set of standards are thinking about the standard developmentally, but not by age. Because we could have kiddos coming into a pre-kindergarten situation who have never been in preschool before. It's their first time in formal schooling. They may have some developmental delays. So the state wanted to create a document where instead of thinking about what students should be learning by their age, we're thinking about what students should be learning based on what they already know. So here is an overview of the standards, and I'll just jump down here to language and literacy. You have language and communication, phonological awareness, print awareness, and emergent writing. Those are the strands. Then you have an alphanumeric code, so it'll be 2A, 2B, 2C. You need that code. And then you'll have the actual statement standard. So under print awareness, that strand, there are 2 standards. Develops knowledge of print organization and develops knowledge of the alphabet. And underneath, when you actually go into the standards themselves, so you will see the standard, but the nice thing is you get a developmental kind of progression of what that standard looks like. So let me give you an example. In the standards packet that I printed for you, it'll say language and literacy, and it says demonstrates understanding of increasingly complex language. But then it starts with really emergent things, like at first kids attend to the language, and then they engage in back and forth interactions with the caregivers. And that all happens way before they demonstrate understanding of complex concepts and longer sentences. And whenever you want to know what one of these indicators could look like in a classroom, you can come over here to the examples. So we can think about understanding increasingly complex language from beginning with smiling, cooing, wriggling, just attending to language in very general terms, all the way to following multiple step directions. So regardless of what age you're working with in your preschool, you could start looking for these early indicators and then placing your student what they are able to do, and then understand that if they are able to do this, then the next thing they could learn is right here, and this is what it could look like. So for literacy, and specifically for develops knowledge of print organization, which would be what we're talking about for concepts about print. Very early concepts about print are things like just being interested in the books, picking them up, noticing them, bringing books to caregivers to read. Those are some interesting behaviors that show kids are beginning to think about print. And these get slightly more sophisticated with each step, until you actually have kids moving their pointer from left to right over words in a book while the teacher is reading the story. That's pretty complex directional behavior. So they always start early and they get to more complex. So this is what the standard looks like. Now you could say, okay, what if I want to teach punctuation? If I want to teach, if my students can do all of these things, if my students can do all of these print organization standards, then I would need to think about more complicated things to teach them. And you could possibly have a student who already understands the front of the book and can point to the text when they're reading. And you might want to talk about something like punctuation. If that's the case, if you have data that your student knows all of these preschool standards, then also on our Brightspace there is a set of standards for K-12 literacy. And these K-12 literacy standards are written a little bit differently. They are written by grade level. So this is the strand, Reading Foundations. That's where you would find things like concepts about print, phonological awareness, alphabet knowledge, and phonics. Those are foundational skills. And again, you have an alphanumeric code here, RFK1, and then there's A, B, C, and D. And for print concepts, you can see in kindergarten, we're thinking about things like following left to right, going from the top to the bottom, left page before right page, that they recognize that spoken words are represented in written language, so they know things like words and letters. And then over here, this one, I think, this is terrible. Recognize and name all upper and lowercase letters of the alphabet. Most people in my discipline would understand that as alphabetic principle and not a concept about print. Over here, so over even in this area, I don't see anything that's focused on students learning punctuation. So really, if I was going to teach in my lesson the meaning of the exclamation mark, I might point to this standard. Reading Foundation, grade 1, talks about demonstrating an understanding of the organization of basic features of print by recognizing and distinguishing features of a sentence like the first word, capitalization, and ending punctuation. So if I was going to teach something beyond the preschool standards, I'd want to know first that my students could do those preschool things. There weren't any emergent things I needed to deal with. And then I could just look here for places that the state of Ohio is saying that instruction is useful, but possibly for older kids. It's okay to teach things a little bit beyond where kids are, as long as you have assessment that shows they're ready for it. So let's move on to thinking about how to create this lesson plan. We'll also soon think about how to create plans for documentation, but we're really just going to talk in this screencast about creating the lesson plan. Eventually, we'll talk about how to collect and also write your teaching and learning commentary. When you turn in the teaching application assignment, you will turn in a lesson plan, which we're going to talk about right now. You'll turn in your documentation of student learning, and then you'll turn in a little bit of a written document where you talk about what the students learned and what you did well in teaching and what you might do differently. Commentary is based on what you see happening in your documentation of learning. Let's focus on creating a lesson plan. Okay, it would be helpful probably to take out the example, the teaching application 1 example that I gave you in class of a lesson application focused on read aloud with print referencing. And we'll talk through the parts. You can use this example as sort of a template. I think it might be a smart thing to just go ahead and use the headings that I provide on the example, and that way you'd make sure that you had all of the sections of a lesson plan. The first thing that you're going to do is make sure you have your name on it, and you're going to identify this as which one of your teaching applications they are. If you want to describe the lesson some way, name it some way, you can do that up here. The first official part of the plan is the learning goal, and we are not doing behavioral objectives. We're just going to say what we think the students are learning in this work. So a simple sentence, what do you think the students are learning in this work? The next piece is you're going to have a rationale, and your rationale has to have 2 parts. The first part of your rationale should be student learning data, and right here would be where you talk about how you know what students are ready to learn. So in my example, I say in the library center, I noticed that students are retelling stories and looking at pictures. There is little evidence that they are attending to words or pointing to print or talking about print when they read. So this, or pretend to read, this read aloud will bring their attention to the term word and exclamation mark. Now, this lesson plan was written using the older standards. So I would like to point your attention to the idea that you would be looking at the new standards for your lesson plan. And so the new lesson plan standards for print organization, they do have a section here about students moving with a pointer and pointing over words left to right. And I think what I'm showing kids doing is a little bit more sophisticated than just pointing to the text, where the text is, especially that area where I'm going to ask them to identify the exclamation mark. I'm going to use the first grade standard here about ending punctuation for that. So you look for where your intended instructional goal maps onto the early learning standards. And so instead of what you have on your document, I would say my focus for instruction probably better aligns with RFK for kindergarten 1B. Recognize that spoken words are represented in written language by specific sequences of letters. Basically, print contains the message. And RF 1.1, so this is the first grade standard, demonstrate the understanding of organization of basic features of print by recognizing and distinguishing features of a sentence like the exclamation mark. So rationale has discussion of student learning data that helps you understand why you're teaching this lesson, and a standard or two that address what it is you're teaching. So we have learning goal, rationale with the two parts, data and standards, and then you're going to also have in your rationale evidence-based practice. Remember, in the state of Ohio, we can't teach anything unless it's research, evidence-based, an approved curriculum, or research supported. And so what you could do here is you could take, for your evidence-based, you could take your annotation that you did for the Zucker, Ward, and Justice. This is just describing how to do print referencing read aloud, and you could pop that right into this lesson plan document. The next piece of the lesson, now we're moving in from rationale. So this rationale is, here's the data that says this lesson is good, here is the standard that says this lesson is appropriate, and here is research that shows that the way I'm going to teach this lesson is appropriate. So we move from rationale to opening moves. And opening moves in preschool, you really want to get kids physically organized to do the work. So think about that part of it. How are you physically getting kids ready to do the work? And then you want to tell kids explicitly what you're going to teach them. So mine just says, bring kids to the carpet, have them sit in their assigned seats, start with belly breathing to do some calming down before we get them ready to interact in the lesson. And then I'm going to have this quote, I'm going to read you a story and I'll need your help. Because essentially that's what print referencing is. The student is listening to you read and giving you help when you ask questions. The next part of the lesson is procedures. And the easiest way to do this for print referencing is after you've organized your text with Post-its that determine where you're going to be asking certain kinds of questions, to just walk through your text and write those prompts down. So you can see I'm just pulling, these are from the Post-its that are on my cover. And then over here, here's my page 1. I'm going to introduce this idea of speech bubbles. I'm going to have students say that. I think it's always important when you're going to introduce a new concept to ask students to say that word at least once. I think when I demonstrated reading the Night Animals book, I had you say the word exclamation mark 3 different times. If a word is hard, have kids repeat it multiple times so that they really can get a sense of that new term. So I've got stage directions. So if I want to do something with my hand or body or whatever, I put those in parentheses. Those are my stage directions. And then I do also have some things I'm going to say. And here I've just isolated them, make them a little apparent in the lesson plan by making them bold and italics. You can play with the formatting, but what you really want to have is a series of numbered steps. Here's what I'm going to do. And it should be clear enough that if you were to give this lesson plan to someone else, they would be able to follow your plan, your procedures, and know exactly what you wanted them to do or say. I don't get to actually see you do the lesson, so the detail here is my way of understanding how you're organizing instruction. So I would say, let me know what you're going to do or say. It would be inappropriate to have procedures that said something like read the book slowly and talk about apostrophes, right? That's like totally not helping me see exactly what to do and say. I do think the process of putting those post-its on the book ahead of time makes this very easy to type up. The second to the last part of this lesson is ripples and extensions. So especially in preschool, we want to extend the learning beyond the little read aloud situation. So you could think about ways that you could help kids learn more about this idea after the lesson. So some spin-offs or ripples and extensions. I'm going to put the book Night Animals in the reading center and see if kids pick that book up and point to the print as they're retelling the story to friends. I might put use a flashlight to show how a small thing can make a big shadow. We could play with that at a play center. I could create a shadow box with plastic toy animals from the book so that kids can retell the story. They could just take the plastic figures and pretend to retell that whole story. Then I could read another book about nocturnal animals like Owl Moon or Bats at the Beach, or now there is a sequel to Night Animals, so that could be a fun extension. These can develop into full-blown teaching applications if you want, or it just kind of gives you the practice of taking the one thing you're doing and making it even more substantial in the curriculum. The last part of the lesson is the assessment. Now for assessment, what we're going to do in preschool is we're going to do a technique called documentation. So here's an example of what that would look like. This is a plan for documentation. I'm going to watch to see, this is after the lesson, I'm going to watch to see if children point to words at the reading center. So when they're at their reading center, pulling books and looking at them, do they point to words? I'm going to document attempts in photographs. So if I see kids pointing to words, I'm going to take my phone, take a little picture of the child pointing to words, and I can do that without taking a picture of the child's face, just the child pointing to the text. Later ask students what the apostrophe is for. I could do that by just going around and asking kids, pointing to the apostrophe and asking them what it's for. And I could create maybe a little chart where I have all the students' names down the left, and then I could have identifies the apostrophe here at the top. I could also have a little box that says points to words while reading, and I could note for each student if they were able to do those two things when they were pretend reading. Now this idea of coming up with a plan for documentation is something that we're going to spend some time in class doing. We're going to be reading the Susan Stacy text, Pedagogical Documentation in Early Childhood, and she will give us lots of ideas of how to document or capture students' learning using pictures and words and charts and things like that. Our students in 3 to 5-year-old classrooms are probably too emergent for traditional paper and pencil types of assessments. So this is what your lesson plan could look like. You can play around with format. If you don't like the format that I use, I'm not worried about that. I do want you to have all of these sections that are in bold. I want you to have that included in your lesson plan. So next steps, I think your next steps are to start thinking about what would be an appropriate lesson in your preschool. Start looking at what your kids possibly know about print concepts, and thinking about, based on what they know, what you might teach next.